Okay, welcome, Tony. Thank you for undertaking this interview as part of the BioTrib website and the dissemination that we have to undertake as part of the grant. It's going to be a series of presentations or interviews delivered by kind of various academics, industrialists, policymakers over the next kind of 3 or 4 years that we'll put together and deliver kind of onto the website. So thank you once again for accepting the invitation. Could you, one of the focuses that we're really interested in is your role within the LifeLongJoints project and your close collaboration with Stephen Ferguson at ETH in Zurich. So could you just provide an overview of your role in LifeLongJoints, what opportunities it gave you, and and how you moved the research forward?
Yes, hi, I'm Tony Redmond. I'm a professor in clinical biomechanics at University of Leeds. I'm based within the School of Medicine, and my biomechanics research is very much the patient-facing side, and that's really the complementary side in LifeLongJoints to some of the more engineering basic science. So my role in LifeLongJoints was originally planned to be relatively minor. We were tucked away in a small corner of a work package that represented a relatively small proportion of LifeLongJoints, but crucially what we were offering was probably the only patient interface in the whole of the LifeLongJoints program. So LifeLongJoints was very much about engineering coatings and then testing those coatings. And I think it's fair to say at the beginning we thought that the role would be really rather small. We were using fairly, at the time, traditional motion capture techniques to measure what patients were doing in our laboratory. But what we were able to do through LifeLongJoints particularly was build up some expertise with some novel computational modeling approaches, particularly multi-body modeling in conjunction with Anybody Technologies and with Stephen Ferguson's lab at ETH Zurich. And it really allowed us to maximize the benefits of what we were bringing on the clinical side. So within LifeLongJoints, our role was to recruit a cohort of patients who had already undergone total hip replacement and to capture the motions and the loadings that were applied to the joints in those people who genuinely had hip replacements already in situ. Mm-hmm. And I think what really made the difference was that we were able to recruit a large cohort. So we recruited 150 or so patients with hip replacements. And we were able to get those patients to do, as I mentioned, the things that people with hip replacements actually do. So rather than just have them walking up and down in a laboratory and getting very sort of vanilla motion capture, we were able to challenge them to do the things that they would really expect their joints to be able to do in terms of loads and motions. So we had them lunging and squatting and climbing stairs, descending stairs, doing sit to stand. And so we were able to capture the larger range of motions and adverse loading scenarios, as we call them. But also because we had quite a large sample, so a sample of 150 or so, we could also stratify the sample for different characteristics. And this is particularly relevant in relation to the hip joint, because as we saw with the ASR problem, when ASR hips failed at a higher rate than expected, they also failed in different populations at different rates. And that really hadn't been expected and hadn't been well understood. And so essentially what we did in LifeLongJoints is we brought together the advanced computational modeling, the multi-body modeling, to actually derive for the first time sort of bearing loads, as well as the sort of traditional kinematics and moments and the like. And we were able to do that in a much larger sample that we could slice and dice and start to tease apart a little bit more. And I think the relationship between Steve and I grew because we had access to the large samples. We're based in a hospital, and we had the facilities to do the data capture and to actually process it. We had a postdoc researcher, David Lunn, who was working on the project, so we were developing the model locally, but we also were able to tie into the expertise that Stephen had. And I think we both found a benefit. We benefited from being able to tap into Stephen's expertise, and I think Stephen really benefited from the much closer clinical application of the modelling approaches in the way that we were employing them in LifeLongJoints.
Right. So when you developed this partnership, the LifeLongJoints project itself lasted 5 years, and you were pretty much in from the start. It developed. So what do you think? Because you're in Leeds, you're in the provincial part of the UK, as it were. Stephen's in a major city in in Switzerland, in Zurich. So what are the challenges then of kind of doing that sort of research, that closely linked research where you're dependent on kind of other parties?
I think it's about relationships, and it's the LifeLongJoints project was a very collegial project anyway. It was one of the most delightful projects I've been involved in a 20+ year academic career. I got on very well with Stephen, but also key to it, I've mentioned postdoctoral researchers already, David Lunn, and the researchers involved in LifeLongJoints at a slightly more junior level also got on really well. And since LifeLongJoints has finished, Dave has been over to visit Stephen's PhD students as friends, not just as co-workers and colleagues. So I think what really lubricated the wheels of those relationships was the fact that we all got on so well. The LifeLongJoints project was also well supported to encourage engagement, regular networking meetings and the like. And again, the fact that it was computational modeling meant that we could do an awful lot of it online, and we could make genuine advances in the modeling approaches without necessarily having to be in the same place. But at the same time, we had the resource in LifeLongJoints to be able to be in the same place if we needed to make the sort of the big steps. And we had a couple of times where we spent a few days where we set aside 2 days completely to be in the same place, either in Leeds or in Zurich, to go through a set of problems and to reach a sort of a predetermined point at the end of those times.
Fantastic. And you said, you've also mentioned earlier that the work involved adverse loadings of the hip. And this is, as you say, it's been brought up time and time again as a kind of one of the factors in failure, particularly on metals or surface replacement type implants. How has your data, therefore, impacted on the wider community? Has it kind of got out there yet, or does that take time for the data to reach the interested parties, to be disseminated?
It's an interesting one, because my answer is really about your definition of interested parties. Yeah. I think what our data did was it threw down a challenge. I think it comes from a bit of a moral high ground, a position of high morality, insofar as we are saying, regardless of ISO, these new data are the loads and the motions that these hip joint implants are being subject to in patients with hip replacements. It's not hypothetical, it's not modeled. This is actually what they're expected to be able to withstand, and it's not reflected in the testing. So I think we have a really easy job in laying down the challenge to say to the industry, you really should be testing to these sorts of demands and requirements rather than to a safer set. And then coming back to the point about it depends who the interested parties are, the difficulty there is where you apply that pressure. And I think we've been to ASTM meetings in the US, and there was a good deal of interest from the FDA representation within ASTM to accept the challenge. There was some appetite from the more academic members of the ASTM committees to at least consider the challenge further. And it's fair to say there were some reservations, particularly from some of the industrially linked representatives or delegates, in how you would actually go about implementing this. And it's all very well for us to say from a moral high ground that this is what you should do, but it's clearly a different kettle of fish if you're actually trying to implement it. So I think we've certainly started the dialogue. I've felt very little resistance to our challenge, to our saying we simply should do a better job. And I think in the face of ASR, it's irrefutable. I've made the case before that unless we're going to stand still, we are going to have areas of research and research efforts which end in dead ends and end in failure. And I don't have a problem with that. That's part of what the research process is about. I think that what ASR has taught us is that we need to do a better job of the earlier phase testing so that we don't have a joint that's already in 30,000 people before we realize its shortcomings. And it's the fact that those shortcomings weren't expected and the scale of the problem is the issue rather than the failure itself.
I suppose in a way that industry may be, I wouldn't say resistant, but maybe concerned about doing additional testing, is that they only have a limited capability, don't they, in terms of mechanical simulators. I'm not quite sure how many there are in the world, but there's not that many. Yeah. And you run a typical ISO test maybe for 3 or 4 months. you're effectively, you know, because of the replicates, you're doing 6 per test. So to do any comparison, it's nearly a year by the time you've done the test. But there is a kind of a new science in, and that's that of regulatory science, particularly the idea of in silico modelling, the digital twin, as some people call it. And I wonder what role your data can play in that then, you know, to providing this extra kind of capacity.
So to reply to the first part of your question, which was a comment really, I think that there's an issue here in the device industry, the medical tech industry, of budgets. I work across rheumatology and orthopedics, and the expectation and the regulatory requirement for pharmaceutical companies is absolutely enormous. And there's no thought to shortcutting it. The pharma companies are bought into full compliance with the regulators, and they're prepared to spend an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time delaying products coming to market in order to comply. And I think, you know, there's a strong argument that the same should apply to the devices industry. I think the reason it doesn't is purely pragmatic, that there isn't as much money in the devices industry, and because it isn't part of a culture that's been 50 years in the making, it hasn't developed as far. I don't think that means that we should accept that it shouldn't happen. I think in an ideal world, probably medical devices, implanted medical devices, should face exactly the sort of scrutiny that a new drug might have to face before it's applied to humans. However, there isn't as much money in the devices industry, and we are looking for ways to shortcut the process, if you like. And I think the idea of effectively in silico randomized controlled trials is probably quite compelling. One of the things that we can do with the multi-body modeling and computational approaches is we can apply hypothetical scenarios. So we can look at conditions which don't necessarily exist in a current data set, and we can use them to explore how an implant might perform in certain circumstances, under certain loadings, in certain positions, certain surgical differences. And I think there's a whole load of scope to explore how we can push the envelope a little bit in understanding implant performance without necessarily needing to do that in humans.
So this idea that you'd have a kind of model that you could almost envisage you tailoring it to an individual and saying, will this implant be the best one for this individual under these particular circumstances?
And we already do that with the multi-body modeling. We're already doing that. We can combine the conventional motion capture, that's a laboratory-based motion capture, with imaging. At the Leeds Biomedical Research Centre, we have research-dedicated MRI facilities. There are some issues there around metal implants, but certainly with access to either MRI with metal suppression algorithms or with computed tomography, CT, we can get internal imaging and we can map that across onto the traditional motion capture, and we can scale models. We can do things with the models. As part of LifeLongJoint, we developed a mocap computational multi-body model that actually had a hip implant embedded within it, so we can then parameterize that hip implant. We can look at offset, we can look at inclination angles, we can look at axial rotation, and we can start to explore what that would do to joint surface loading, joint contact loading. So there's all sorts of possibilities from here. At the moment, we've only scratched the surface of what we could do with the current data set, and we're only looking at one data set. I think there's an awful lot more that can be done. Okay, thank you. So kind of my final question is that, going forward, it's a relatively exciting, it's a really exciting, it's not relatively, it's a really exciting area, in that, you can bring these new ideas to the fore, you can bring these kind of, perhaps not only can you engage the regulatory process in terms of trying to make these devices more safer, but perhaps you can also do it quicker. And of course, and one thing from a kind of experimentalist, you can also identify those particular scenarios which may be considered to be quite adverse, and provided the simulators can do it, you can validate them in a mechanical simulation. So I think that's really powerful, actually. And my kind of final question is, well, it comes in two parts really. If you envisage in 10 years' time, where would you like the industry to be in terms of hip testing, and where do you think it will be? So where I'd like it to be in terms of testing, I think the lessons we've learned from LifeLongJoints can be applied in other joints as well. And I think so that's simply scaling up and rolling out would would be a sort of natural progression. But I think picking up on your last point, probably I don't think we need in the 21st century, going into the sort of middle of the 21st century, to necessarily be relying solely on hardware testing. I can see how we could have some hardware testing that acts as anchor points, and that we can fill in multiple points with the sort of computational in silico trials type approach. So where would I like to see us in 10 years' time? I would probably like to see some concentrated adverse loading testing centers where a limited number of machines are housed that can do the adverse loading scenarios that we're coming up with for hips, for knees, for spines, for ankles, for other types of joint and other types of hardware, and that we can join the data points virtually with computational modeling to try and get a picture of what would happen without having to test every single scenario. I think at the moment we're testing every single scenario very simply. I think testing fewer scenarios comprehensively and then using modern computational methods to fill the gaps would probably be a much more efficient approach to doing that. Where do I think we'll be? Probably doing much more of much the same as what we do now, I fear. I think in 10 years' time, there's enough resistance in the system that I don't see industry is going to move a long way particularly quickly. There's some movement beyond compliance in Europe, for instance, is the industry's attempt to self-regulate to a degree, but also have control over the regulation and not to hand it over completely. So I think we will start to make progress in silico trials, in silico testing. I think we will have provided the capacity to join the dots across a range of areas. Whether or not we'll actually be there in 10 years' time, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, Professor Redmond. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you again.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.